Right now, as you're watching this video, something absolutely historic is happening in South America, and I guarantee you most people have no idea. While the world was distracted by elections, wars, and economic chaos, Venezuela just made a move that could fundamentally reshape global power. Not in decades, not in years. Right now, here's what terrifies me about this moment. It's not just that America missed it, it's that America still doesn't understand what just happened. And by the time Washington wakes up, it might be too late to stop what's coming. You see, this isn't just about oil. This isn't just about one country in South America. This is about the quiet collapse of an empire that doesn't even realize it's falling. And the most chilling part, history has seen this before. Every great power that fell, Rome, Britain, Spain, they all had one thing in common. They were blind to their own decline until the moment it became irreversible. So let me ask you this. What happens when the world's most powerful country loses control of its own backyard? What happens when allies start choosing sides and they're not choosing America? The answer is unfolding right now in Venezuela, and it's going to change everything. Let me paint you a picture of what just happened, because if you're getting your news from mainstream media, you probably missed the most important geopolitical shift in decades. 3 weeks ago, Nicolas Maduro, yes, the same Maduro that Washington has been trying to overthrow for years, made an announcement that sent shockwaves through every major capital in the world, except apparently Washington. Venezuela officially abandoned the US dollar for all international trade, not just some trade, all trade. But here's the kicker. They didn't just abandon the dollar. They created something new. A oil-backed digital currency supported by, wait for it, China, Russia, Iran, and 12 other nations that are absolutely done with American financial dominance. Now, if you're thinking, so what, Venezuela's economy is a mess anyway, you're missing the point entirely. This isn't about Venezuela's economy. This is about what Venezuela represents. And more importantly, it's about who's backing them. Because here's what really happened. China didn't just support this move, China orchestrated it. Beijing has been planning this for years, quietly building the infrastructure, the relationships, the financial mechanisms to make this moment possible. And America was busy arguing about domestic politics while losing its grip on the most fundamental source of its global power, the dollar's dominance in international trade. Let me tell you why this matters more than any headline you've read this year. When countries stop using your currency, they stop needing your permission. When they stop needing your permission, they stop fearing your sanctions. And when they stop fearing your sanctions, your empire becomes just another country with a big military and a lot of debt. That's what just happened in real time. While America wasn't looking, to understand why this Venezuelan move is so dangerous, you need to understand something most Americans have forgotten. The United States didn't become the world's superpower because of its military, not primarily anyway. America became the world's dominant force because of something called the Bretton Woods system. In 1944, as World War II was ending, the world's powers met in New Hampshire and made a decision that would shape the next 80 years of history. They agreed that the US dollar would become the world's reserve currency. Every major trade, every oil transaction, every international deal, it would all flow through American banks using American currency under American oversight. This gave the United States something no empire in history had ever possessed: the ability to control global commerce without firing a shot. Think about it this way. Every time any country in the world bought oil from Saudi Arabia, they had to get dollars first. That meant going through American financial institutions, which meant America could see every transaction, control every flow of capital, and shut down any country's economy with the flip of a switch. This is how America funded its global military presence. This is how it maintained 800 military bases around the world. This is how it could spend more on defense than the next 10 countries combined. Not through taxes, not through conquests, through the simple fact that the world needed dollars to function. But empires that rely on financial dominance have a weakness, a fatal weakness that has brought down every empire in history. They forget that their power is dependent on others choosing to participate. And choice, by definition, means people can choose differently. That's exactly what's happening now. And Venezuela just lit the fuse. Here's what makes this moment so dangerous. Venezuela didn't act alone. They acted because they saw that America's financial empire was already crumbling, and they decided to give it a push. Let me show you the cracks that were already forming. In 2014, Russia started building alternative payment systems after US sanctions hit them for Ukraine. They created something called SPFS, their own version of SWIFT, the global banking communication network that America controls. In 2019, China launched the digital yuan and started pushing countries to use it for trade instead of dollars. Quietly, systematically, nation by nation, in 2021, the European Union began developing its own payment system, partly to reduce dependence on American financial infrastructure. By 2023, more than 40% of global trade was being conducted in currencies other than the dollar. That's the lowest percentage in 50 years. And then came the moment that changed everything. When America froze Russia's foreign reserves in 2022, something clicked for every other country watching. They realized that holding dollars wasn't safe anymore, that America would weaponize its currency against anyone it disagreed with. Suddenly, every nation started asking the same question: what if we're next? That fear, that simple fear, is what gave China and Russia the opening they'd been waiting for. Because once countries start looking for alternatives to the dollar, those alternatives start to look very attractive. And that's when Venezuela stepped forward and said, we'll be first. But here's what should absolutely terrify anyone who cares about American power. Venezuela wasn't first, they were just the first to do it publicly. How many other countries have been quietly moving away from the dollar while America wasn't paying attention? How many deals have been made in yuan, rubles, or gold that never showed up in American headlines? The answer is going to shock you. While America was focused on its own domestic chaos, something extraordinary was happening around the world. Countries were quietly, systematically reducing their dollar holdings and their dependence on American financial systems. And they were doing it so carefully, so gradually, that most American policymakers still don't understand the scale of what's happening. Let me give you some numbers that will make your head spin. In 2000, the US dollar made up 71% of global foreign exchange reserves. By 2023, that number had dropped to 59%. That might not sound dramatic, but in the world of reserve currencies, that's an earthquake. China's yuan went from 1% of global reserves to 7% in just 5 years. Russia and China have increased their gold holdings by 300% since 2014. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, now represent 32% of global GDP, and they're actively building trade mechanisms that bypass the dollar entirely. But numbers only tell part of the story. The real story is in the relationships that have been forming while America wasn't looking. Saudi Arabia, America's most important ally in the Middle East, the country that has backed the petrodollar system for 50 years, started accepting yuan for oil payments in 2022. They did it quietly, without fanfare, but the implications are staggering. India, supposedly a strategic partner against China, has been buying Russian oil with rubles and yuan to avoid US sanctions. Brazil and Argentina have started conducting trade in their own currencies, cutting the dollar out entirely. Even America's closest allies are hedging their bets. France has been pushing for European financial independence. Germany has increased its gold reserves significantly. Japan has started exploring alternatives to dollar-dominated trade with Asian partners. This is what a silent revolution looks like. No declarations of war, no dramatic announcements, just the steady, methodical dismantling of the system that has kept America at the center of the global economy. And Venezuela's announcement wasn't the beginning of this process. It was the moment the revolution decided to stop being silent. Now, let's talk about the real genius behind Venezuela's move, because this wasn't Maduro's idea. This was Beijing's masterstroke years in the making. China has been playing a game that America didn't even realize was happening. While Washington was fighting wars in the Middle East and dealing with domestic political chaos, Beijing was quietly building the infrastructure to replace the American financial system. Think about it this way. America built its empire by controlling the flow of money. So China decided to build alternative flows. The Belt and Road Initiative wasn't just about building roads and ports. It was about creating trade relationships that didn't depend on American banks or American currency. Every country that took Chinese investment became a little more dependent on Chinese financial systems and a little less dependent on American ones. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank wasn't just a development bank, it was a direct competitor to the World Bank and the IMF institutions that America has used to maintain its global influence for decades. And the digital yuan, that wasn't just a new form of money. It was a weapon designed to bypass the SWIFT system that America uses to monitor and control international transactions. But here's what makes China's strategy so brilliant. They didn't try to overthrow the American system directly. That would have been too obvious, too threatening. Instead, they built parallel systems and waited for countries to choose. And Venezuela just proved that the parallel systems are ready. When Maduro announced Venezuela's new oil-backed digital currency, he wasn't just making a statement about Venezuelan independence. He was demonstrating that China's alternative financial infrastructure actually works, that countries can trade, conduct international business, and maintain their sovereignty without bowing to Washington. But the most terrifying part for America, this is just the beginning. Because now that one country has proven it can be done, others are going to follow, and each country that follows makes the next one easier until what started as a trickle becomes an avalanche. China knows this, Russia knows this, Iran knows this. The question is, does America know this? Here's what should keep every American policymaker awake at night. The United States is facing the most serious challenge to its global dominance in 80 years, and most of the political establishment still doesn't understand what's happening. Why? Because America has confused military power with actual power for so long that it can't see its real vulnerabilities. Let me explain what I mean. When policymakers in Washington think about threats to American dominance, they think about military challenges, Chinese aircraft carriers, Russian nuclear weapons, Iranian missiles. But Venezuela didn't challenge America with weapons. They challenged America with something far more dangerous, an alternative. And alternatives are the one thing that empires can never survive, because empires aren't maintained by force, they're maintained by the absence of choices. When subjects have no choice but to participate in your system, you have an empire. When they start having choices, you have a problem. The Roman Empire didn't fall because barbarians were stronger. It fell because Roman provinces started choosing to align with barbarian kings who offered better deals. The British Empire didn't collapse because of military defeats. It collapsed because colonies realized they could thrive without British control. America's empire is facing the same dynamic, and the tragedy is that American leaders are so focused on military threats that they're missing the economic revolution happening right under their noses. While the Pentagon worries about hypersonic missiles, Beijing is systematically undermining the financial systems that actually maintain American power. While Congress debates military budgets, dozens of countries are quietly reducing their dependence on American banks, American currency, and American approval for their international business. This is strategic blindness of the highest order, and Venezuela's move just made it impossible to ignore anymore. But here's what's even more troubling. Even now, even after Venezuela's announcement sent shockwaves through global markets, the American response has been more sanctions, more of the same tools that are driving countries away from the American system in the first place. It's like trying to stop a house fire by pouring gasoline on it. What happened next should have been predictable, but somehow caught American officials completely off guard. Within 72 hours of Venezuela's announcement, three more Latin American countries announced they were exploring alternatives to dollar-dominated trade. Brazil's president gave a speech about the need for financial sovereignty. Argentina started negotiating oil purchases in yuan. This is how empires collapse, not through dramatic military defeats, but through cascading defections as subjects realize they have alternatives. And the momentum is accelerating. Iran immediately announced support for Venezuela's new system and suggested that all oil-producing nations should follow suit. Russia offered technical assistance and promised to be among the first adopters. China, of course, pledged to purchase Venezuelan oil exclusively through the new system. But the real earthquake came from an unexpected source. India, India, which America has been courting as a strategic partner against China, announced that it was studying the Venezuelan model and might implement something similar for its own energy purchases. Not as a challenge to America, they were careful to say, but as a matter of diversifying financial risk. This is how it happens. Countries don't announce that they're abandoning America. They announce that they're diversifying. They frame it as prudent financial management, not geopolitical rebellion. But the effect is the same. Each defection makes the next one easier. Each alternative system that proves viable encourages more countries to explore their own alternatives. What starts as one country's experiment becomes a regional trend, then a global movement. And here's the most dangerous part. Once this process reaches a certain point, it becomes self-reinforcing. Countries start choosing alternatives not because they dislike America, but because that's where the business is going. When enough countries are trading in yuan, it becomes more convenient to use yuan. When enough banks are connected to alternative payment systems, it becomes more efficient to use those systems. When enough investment is flowing through non-American channels, it becomes more profitable to tap into those channels. This is the network effect that built America's financial dominance in the first place. And now it's working against America, building momentum for systems that don't need American participation or permission. Venezuela didn't just make an announcement. They started an avalanche. If you want to understand what's really happening right now, you need to look at history because this exact scenario has played out before with empires that thought they were too big to fall. Let me tell you about the British Empire in 1920. Britain controlled the world's reserve currency, the pound sterling. British banks dominated international finance. British naval power kept global trade routes open. The British Empire covered a quarter of the world's surface and ruled over 400 million people. If you had asked anyone in London in 1920 whether the British Empire could collapse within a generation, they would have laughed at you. Britain was too powerful, too established, too central to the global system. But by 1950, the empire was gone, not conquered, just obsolete. What happened? The same thing that's happening to America now. Alternative systems emerged that offered better deals to Britain's subjects. The United States provided more investment, more technology, better trade terms. Countries started choosing American partnerships over British ones, not because they hated Britain, but because America offered more value. And once that process started, it accelerated. Each country that chose America made it easier for the next country to make the same choice. British dominance evaporated not through military defeat, but through a cascade of economic defections. The British pound lost its status as the world's reserve currency. British banks lost their central role in international finance. British military power became irrelevant because countries no longer needed British protection, they had American alternatives. Sound familiar? But here's the part that should terrify American policymakers. The British saw it coming. British leaders in the 1930 seconds and 1940 seconds understood exactly what was happening. They wrote reports, held conferences, proposed solutions. It didn't matter. Once the process of imperial decline reaches a certain point, it becomes irreversible regardless of how clearly leaders understand what's happening. The question isn't whether America's leaders will wake up to the threat. They will. The question is whether they'll wake up in time to do anything about it. And based on the response to Venezuela so far, the answer might be no. Let's be brutally honest about what China is doing here, because their strategy is nothing short of brilliant. Beijing isn't trying to replace America as the global hegemon, at least not directly. That would be too expensive, too risky, and too likely to provoke a direct confrontation that nobody wants. Instead, China is doing something much smarter. They're creating a multipolar world where no single country has the kind of overwhelming dominance that America has enjoyed since 1945. Think about it from China's perspective. They don't need to rule the world. They just need to make sure that America can't dictate terms to everyone else. They don't need the yuan to become the world's reserve currency. They just need the dollar to stop being the only reserve currency. Venezuela's move serves this strategy perfectly. Every country that adopts alternatives to the dollar system makes the world a little more multipolar and a little less American dominated. But here's what makes China's approach so dangerous for America. They're not asking countries to choose between America and China. They're offering countries the option to not have to choose at all. Want to trade with America? Great, use dollars. Want to trade with China? Use yuan. Want to avoid sanctions and financial pressure? Use alternative systems that neither America nor China can control. This is genius level strategy. China gets the benefits of undermining American dominance without taking on the costs of replacing it. They create alternatives without creating direct confrontation. They weaken American power while maintaining plausible deniability. And countries love this approach because it gives them more options, more independence, more ability to pursue their own interests without worrying about superpower pressure. Venezuela's announcement wasn't just about oil or economics. It was a proof of concept that China's multipolar vision actually works, that countries can prosper, trade, and maintain their sovereignty without submitting to any single empire's rules. That's a much more attractive offer than anything America has provided in decades, and it's spreading faster than anyone in Washington realizes. Behind closed doors in Washington, there are people who understand exactly what Venezuela's move represents. And they're terrified, not because of Venezuela itself. Nobody in the Pentagon loses sleep over Venezuelan military power. They're terrified because of what Venezuela's success could inspire. Here's the nightmare scenario that keeps intelligence analysts awake at night. What if Saudi Arabia follows Venezuela's example? The Saudis have been quietly diversifying away from the dollar for years, and they've been increasingly frustrated with American pressure over human rights, Yemen, and Iran policy. If the Venezuelan model proves viable, why wouldn't the Saudis create their own oil-backed currency system? What if Nigeria, Angola, and other major oil producers decide they want the same independence? What if the entire global energy market starts moving away from dollar-denominated trade? But it gets worse. What if this spreads beyond energy? What if Brazil creates a agricultural commodity currency for food exports? What if Indonesia does the same for minerals? What if countries start creating specialized alternative currencies for every major sector of international trade? The result would be the fragmentation of the global economy into multiple currency zones, with America controlling just one piece of a much larger puzzle. The dollar would still be important, but it wouldn't be essential, and important but not essential is not a foundation for empire. This is why the reaction from Washington has been so aggressive and so panicked. They're not just responding to Venezuela, they're trying to prevent a model from spreading that could fundamentally reshape global power. But here's what American policymakers still don't understand. The harder they push back against alternatives, the more attractive those alternatives become. Every sanction, every threat, every attempt to force countries back into the dollar system just proves that the system is coercive rather than beneficial. And in a world where countries have choices, coercion is a losing strategy. Perhaps the most alarming development for American power isn't what enemies are doing, it's what allies are doing. Because while America has been focused on obvious threats like China and Russia, its own allies have been quietly preparing for a world where American dominance isn't guaranteed. Take Germany, for example. Germany has been one of America's closest allies since World War II, but in the past 5 years, Germany has significantly increased its gold reserves, uh, reduced its holdings of U.S. Treasury bonds, invested heavily in alternative payment systems, strengthened economic ties with China despite American pressure, supported European financial independence initiatives. This is an anti-American policy. German leaders still speak warmly about the transatlantic relationship, but they're hedging their bets, preparing for a world where Europe might need to stand on its own financially. The same pattern is emerging across America's alliance network. Japan has quietly increased trade with China and Russia. South Korea has joined Chinese-led development banks. Even Canada has started exploring alternatives to dollar-dominated trade with Asian partners. Again, none of this is being presented as anti-American. Allies aren't declaring independence from the American system. They're just diversifying their options. But the effect is the same. Each ally that develops alternatives to American financial systems weakens America's ability to use economic pressure as a tool of diplomacy. Each partnership that bypasses American institutions reduces American relevance in global economic decisions. Venezuela's success makes this trend more likely to accelerate. If a isolated sanctioned country like Venezuela can successfully create alternatives to American financial systems, why can't prosperous allies do the same? The answer is they can. And increasingly, they are. Here's something that most Americans don't understand about their own empire. It's incredibly expensive to maintain. Those 800 military bases around the world, they cost over $150 billion per year to operate. The global military presence that projects American power, it consumes more than half of the federal government's discretionary spending. America has been able to afford this massive military footprint for one reason. The rest of the world has been forced to use American currency for international trade, which means they've been forced to buy American government bonds to get that currency. In other words, the world has been financing America's empire whether they wanted to or not. Every country that needed dollars for international trade was essentially giving the U.S. government an interest-free loan. But what happens when countries don't need dollars anymore? What happens when they can trade oil in yuan, buy goods with digital currencies, and settle international accounts without touching the American financial system? They stop buying American government bonds. They stop financing American military spending. They stop subsidizing American empire. And when that happens, America faces a choice: dramatically scale back its global commitments or find some other way to pay for them. Neither option is politically viable. American voters aren't going to accept massive tax increases to fund overseas military bases. But they're also not going to accept the kind of reduction in American global influence that would come from closing those bases. This is the real danger that Venezuela's move represents, not military threat, but economic reality. The end of the free financing that has made American empire possible. And once that free financing disappears, the entire structure of American global power becomes unsustainable. One of the most dangerous myths about imperial decline is that it happens slowly. giving empires time to adapt and respond. History suggests the opposite. Imperial collapse often happens much faster than anyone expects, including the empires themselves. The Soviet Union looked stable and permanent in 1985. By 1991, it was gone. The British Empire controlled a quarter of the world in 1945. By 1965, most of its colonies were independent. The Spanish Empire dominated global trade in 1580. By 1620, it was financially bankrupt and losing territories across the globe. Why do empires collapse so quickly? Because imperial power is based on perception as much as reality. Once people stop believing in an empire's permanence, they start making decisions as if that empire might not be around forever. And once that shift in perception reaches a critical mass, it becomes self-fulfilling. Countries stop aligning with the empire, not because the empire has gotten weaker, but because they no longer believe it will remain dominant. We might be seeing the beginning of that shift right now. Venezuela's successful defection from the dollar system sends a signal to every other country in the world. American financial dominance is optional. Alternative systems exist. Other choices are possible. If enough countries receive that message and act on it, American dominance could erode much faster than anyone in Washington imagines. The terrifying part is that there might not be obvious warning signs. Empires often look strong right up until the moment they collapse, because the collapse happens in perceptions and relationships that aren't easy to measure. How do you quantify the moment when allies stop trusting your permanence? How do you measure the point at which neutrals start hedging against your decline? How do you track the speed at which alternatives to your system become mainstream? You don't. You just wake up one day and realize that the world has moved on without you. Here's what makes this moment so critical. There's still time for America to adapt to a multipolar world, but that window is closing rapidly. Smart empires throughout history have managed their own transitions from dominance to partnership. Britain, for example, gradually transferred global leadership to the United States rather than fighting a losing battle to maintain imperial control. The result was a special relationship that preserved British influence and prosperity even after the empire ended. America could do something similar. Instead of fighting the rise of alternative financial systems, America could help design them to be compatible with American interests. Instead of trying to prevent other countries from gaining financial independence, America could position itself as the leader of a more cooperative, less coercive global system. But that would require American leaders to accept something that empires always struggle to accept, that dominance is temporary, but influence can be permanent. Unfortunately, the American response to Venezuela suggests that Washington is choosing the other path. Instead of adaptation, America seems to be choosing confrontation. Instead of leading a transition to a multipolar world, America appears determined to fight for a unipolar world that's already disappearing. This is the most dangerous possible approach because it almost guarantees that America will end up with neither dominance nor influence. Countries that are forced to choose between America and alternatives will increasingly choose alternatives, not because they prefer China or Russia, but because they prefer independence. Venezuela's move was a test of whether America would respond with wisdom or with force, with adaptation or with resistance. So far, America is failing that test. And every day that America continues to fail it, the window for a managed transition closes a little more. So where does this go from here? Let me paint you three scenarios, because the future isn't predetermined. It depends on choices that are being made right now. Scenario 1, the cascade. More countries follow Venezuela's example. Within 2 years, half of the world's oil trade is conducted outside the dollar system. Alternative payment networks become mainstream. The dollar loses its status as the primary reserve currency. America faces a fiscal crisis as demand for U.S. government bonds collapses. military spending gets slashed, overseas bases close, American global influence evaporates as quickly as British influence did after World War II. This isn't collapse. America remains a major power, like France or Germany today. But the era of American empire ends, and a truly multipolar world emerges with China, India, a European confederation, and regional powers sharing global influence. Scenario 2, the adaptation. American leaders recognize what's happening and choose to lead the transition instead of fighting it. America helps design new international financial systems that reduce American dominance but preserve American influence. The result is a more cooperative global order, with America as first among equals rather than as hegemon. American prosperity continues, but American empire ends peacefully. Scenario 3, the resistance. America doubles down on maintaining dominance through increasingly desperate measures. Trade wars escalate, military tensions rise, the world divides into competing blocs with America leading one side and China leading the other. The result is a new Cold War, but one where America's bloc is smaller and weaker than the Soviet threat ever was. Global prosperity suffers. The risk of actual war increases dramatically. Which scenario are we heading toward? Based on the response to Venezuela so far, it looks like scenario 3, but the future isn't written yet. The choices made in the next few months will determine whether America's empire ends with adaptation, cascade, or resistance. And those choices will shape not just America's future, but the future of global stability for the next century. As I watch this unfold, as I see America's empire facing the same pressures that have brought down every empire in history, I keep coming back to one question, not whether American dominance will end. History suggests that's inevitable. Every empire falls eventually, and America's empire is facing challenges that no empire has ever successfully overcome. The real question is, will America choose how its empire ends, or will circumstances choose for it? Because here's what history teaches us. Empires that manage their own transitions tend to remain prosperous and influential long after their imperial phase ends. Britain is still wealthy, still important, still influential, just not imperial. But empires that fight their transitions, that resist the forces of change until the very end, tend to experience much harsher landings. They lose not just dominance, but prosperity and influence as well. America still has time to choose the first path, but every response like the one to Venezuela makes the second path more likely. The tragedy is that most Americans don't even realize this choice is being made. They don't understand that their country's empire is facing an existential challenge. They don't see that the next few years will determine whether America ends its imperial phase like Britain did gracefully and strategically, or like so many other empires throughout history, chaotically and catastrophically. Venezuela didn't just announce a new currency system, they fired the starting gun on the final phase of America's imperial story. The question isn't whether that story will end. The question is how. So here we are at the end of an era that most Americans don't even realize is ending. Venezuela, a country most Americans couldn't find on a map, led by a president most Americans consider a joke, just demonstrated that American empire is optional, that alternatives exist, that the world can function without American permission. And while I've been making this video, while you've been watching it, more countries have been making the same calculation, looking at Venezuela's success and asking themselves, why do we need American approval for our own economic decisions? This is how empires end in the modern world, not with invasions or military defeats, but with cascading defections as subjects realize they have choices. The British Empire didn't fall because Britain became weak. It fell because other countries became strong enough to choose independence. The Soviet Empire didn't collapse because America conquered it. It collapsed because Eastern European countries chose to leave. And America's empire won't end because America becomes powerless. It will end because the rest of the world becomes powerful enough to say no. That process started long before Venezuela's announcement, but Venezuela made it visible, undeniable, irreversible. The real question, the question that will define the next chapter of global history, isn't whether America can stop this shift. The question is whether America even realizes the empire is already over. Because right now, while American politicians debate domestic issues and fight partisan battles, the world is quietly moving on, building new systems, creating new relationships, planning for a future where American approval isn't required. And by the time America wakes up to what's happening, it might discover something that every fallen empire eventually learns. The world is bigger than any one country's dreams of permanent dominance. Even America's